What is the One Ring? What powers does it possess beyond making people invisible? How is it forged, and why is it so important? Hello everyone, it's Alex. Welcome to Hidden Realms. The One Ring is the main objective of the Lord of the Rings, and is established as the only artifact whose properties determine the fate of all Middle-earth. Apart from making people invisible and granting them a sort of vision of the astral plane, it also warns and transforms those who are consumed by it, though they never see it because it is so powerful. So why is it so important? Let's start with the story in Middle-earth's Second Age. Sauron was hiding, nursing his wounds after the defeat of his master at the end of the First Age. The extent of his repentance is a matter of debate. I did another video on that if you're interested. But in any event, by around the year 500 of the Second Age, he had become convinced that the Valar had abandoned Middle-earth and that he was the best person to reintroduce a bit of order. He was self-aware enough to know that not everyone would see it that way, particularly the elves, so he had to find a way to control them. After a long time, he emerged into the world with a master plan. A slow-burning master plan, it must be said, but a master plan nonetheless. Sauron is patient, with little else positive. He re-entered society in disguise as Annatar, meaning the Lord of Gifts, an emissary of the Valar, and tried to ingratiate himself with the elves. We read in the Silmarillion that Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, and though they did not know who he truly was, they would not admit him to their lands. But elsewhere, the elves received him gladly. In particular, he was welcomed into Eregion by Celebrimbor, the great smith, who was eager to learn what Annatar could teach him. So, Annatar Hoarshar Sauron moved into Eregion for maybe 3 centuries, working with the smiths there to produce lesser magic rings and the like, the kind that Gandalf would much later describe as essays in the craft of ring-making. After that, they went on to forge the greater rings of power, the 9 later given to mortal men, and the 7 later given to the dwarf lords, though at the time they were just the 16. There seems to have been no original thought from Sauron, at least, to give them to anyone other than the elves. We're told that his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and bring them under his vigilance. I'll do other videos detailing the powers of those rings. Suffice it to say that they granted or amplified power in whoever possessed them. The crucial point here is that Sauron was secretly linking those rings to himself via a master ring, which he then snuck back to Mordor to forge. This is, of course, the One Ring, and this is what Tolkien tells us about it in the Silmarillion. Secretly, Sauron made the One Ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. Much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that One Ring, for the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. Sauron forged it in the Mountain of Fire in the Land of Shadow, and while he wore the One Ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those who wore them. So that was the plan. When he wore the One Ring, he could see everything done using those other rings of power and control what their users did. Basically, it was all about power and control. But Sauron clearly made a mistake, underestimating the elves, because the magic went both ways. When he put on the One Ring, they could sense him trying to control them, so they took off their rings. I'll do another video on the 3 elven rings, the ones that ended up with Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, because they are a separate case. being made without Sauron's direct involvement, though with the same magical technology he had taught Celebrimbor. Hence, the holders of those three never wore or used them, while Sauron possessed his One Ring. As for the 16 rings forged before the One Ring, Sauron gathered them together when he invaded Eregion and most of Middle-earth, and forcibly took them from the elves. He launched his One Ring plan. If he couldn't control the elves through the rings, then how about the other free peoples of Middle-earth? There were 7 dwarf clans, so he gave one to the lord of each of them, and the other 9 went to men. But again, he underestimated his intended prey. We're told that the dwarves proved tough and hard to tame. They would not endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom. Nor can they be turned to shadows. So Sauron failed to control the dwarves too. The rings they had did influence them, of course. Again, that's worth another video. But Sauron couldn't govern their thoughts as he had hoped. The good news for Sauron was that the rings of power did work on men. The 9 he gave to mortal men granted them great power and extended their lives greatly, but slowly turned them into wraiths, completely under Sauron's control. The ring wraiths. The ringverse we all know is therefore in 2 parts. The core of it is about the ring itself. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It was seemingly written by Sauron. Hence, it was etched into the inside of the ring, revealed by fire, and in the Black Speech. It may even have been the magical incantation that Sauron used to create the One Ring. The elven smiths in Eregion, who forged the 16 rings of power, heard in their minds Sauron saying those words when the One Ring was forged. That was what prompted them to take off their rings. The rest of the verse: 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, and 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, seems to have been a later addition by elven historians and lyricists. As we've seen, the 3 rings for the elven kings were never part of Sauron's original plan, nor did he originally plan to give the rings to the dwarves and mortal men. The elven rhyme was just about where they all ended up. So, the One Ring was essentially a plan to control the elves that didn't work, which Sauron then turned into a plan to try to control the dwarves. Again, that didn't really work. And humans, which did work, though it didn't give him control over all humans. This makes it sound like the One Ring isn't that powerful or effective, but it is. It dominated the geopolitical landscape throughout the second half of the Second Age, and was the catalyst for the massive War of the Ring at the end of the Third Age. So what other powers does it have? Well, in many ways it is similar to the other 16 rings. This is how Tolkien describes it, and them in letter 131. The chief power of all the rings alike was the prevention or slowing of decay, i.e., change viewed as a regrettable thing, the preservation of what is desired or loved, or its semblance. This is more or less an elvish motive, but they also enhanced the natural powers of a possessor, thus approaching magic, a motive easily corruptible to evil, a lust for domination. Finally, they had other powers more directly derived from Sauron, the necromancer, as he is called, as he casts a fleeting shadow and presage on the pages of The Hobbit, such as rendering invisible the material body and making things of the invisible world visible. So the One Ring and the other 16 rings, again, not the later 3 elven rings, can make their wearer invisible. We obviously witnessed this happen many times. They can make visible things in the unseen or spiritual realm, like when Frodo sees the Nazgul for what they really are at Weathertop. They slow decay and aging, hence Gollum living for well over 500 years, and Bilbo similarly being long-lived, and they enhance the natural power of the bearer. What makes the One Ring distinct from the other 16 is that it was crafted to contain the powers of the others and control them and their bearers. If you wanted to be able to control those other powerful rings and the powerful elves that bore them, you would need a really powerful bit of magic. This Sauron achieved by pouring his own spirit or soul into the ring. As Tolkien puts it, much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into the One Ring. It was the only way he could make something powerful enough to control all that other power. To modern readers, a reasonable approximation to help us understand is that it's a bit like a Horcrux from Harry Potter, putting a part of your soul into an inadequate object. But more so, the One Ring is not just a backup policy to ensure Sauron can stay alive if someone kills his mortal body. Sauron doesn't need that. He's already immortal. This is putting his life essence and power into something to give it the power to dominate others. Tolkien goes on in that Letter 131 to explain this. He says, "Let a great part of his own inherent power pass into the One Ring. While he wore it, his power on Earth was actually enhanced, and even if he did not wear it, that power existed and was in rapport with himself. He was not diminished unless some other seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron, become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place," which Tolkien immediately notes was the first weakness of the ring. The One Ring doesn't just tempt people with visions of greatness, making them yearn for power. It acts as a multiplier of whatever power they already possess. Power is a rather ephemeral subject in Tolkien lore. It can mean magical powers, physical powers, charisma, or leadership qualities. For the dwarves, the rings of power meant they got better at mining for precious metals. When Sam briefly had the ring, he had visions of being a world-conquering gardener. Bless him. When Sam saw Aragorn commanding a force marching on Mordor, he took it as more evidence that he had the ring. How else could he inspire or order so many people to march to death? So, when watching the films and reading the books, it feels like the One Ring has a mind of its own. It sort of does. Bilbo and Frodo were walking around with a huge part of Sauron and his power in that One Ring, and the influence of Sauron remained. Gandalf and Galadriel were not feigning temptation or exaggerating how powerful they would be with the ring. Tolkien mentioned it almost in passing in the quote we just read, but a sufficiently powerful new owner could even become master of all Sauron had learned or done since the making of the One Ring. Of course, they would probably be able to usurp him themselves, which isn't to say that the ring is sentient. Tolkien didn't go that far. But Gandalf definitely ascribes a desire within it to get back to Sauron, and it seems to drive forward through its ability to expand or contract in size to fit its bearer's finger. He says that it betrayed Isildur by slipping from his finger, it caught Déagol, it abandoned Gollum, and so on. Of course, Gandalf then balances this by saying that there is another force at play, Eru, the one god of Tolkien's world, or fate if you prefer. The ring may have been intentionally abandoned by Gollum in an effort to get back to Sauron, but Bilbo found it because he was meant to, and Bilbo was meant to pass it to Frodo. This brings us to the other great weakness of the ring. If it were somehow destroyed, then because so much of Sauron's power was wrapped up in it, Sauron himself would be, in Tolkien's words, diminished to a vanishing point, and he would be reduced to a shadow, a mere memory of malicious will, a definite weakness, but one that he seems to have never even considered, for two reasons, really. First, the One Ring was nearly impossible to destroy. It would take an even greater smith than him to unmake it, as it were, and there were none in Middle-earth. You could try to melt it, but it was invulnerable to any heat less than the heat that it was forged in, the fiery volcanic heat of Orodruin, and he controlled access to that. Even if someone wanted to destroy it, they wouldn't be able to, because the power of the ring to tempt you with the power it possessed was so great it would stop anyone from trying to destroy it. They could take it all the way to the cracks of doom and not be able to do it, which is part of the explanation for why Mount Doom wasn't particularly well guarded. But more on that another time, because Sauron wasn't wrong there. Frodo couldn't ultimately go through with throwing the ring into the cracks of doom, but for Gollum's intervention, Frodo would have just walked back out with the ring on his finger. But for Gollum, or Fate, or Eru, ultimately the One Ring was powerful because it magnified power that was already there. If Sauron, a hugely powerful entity in his own right, had gotten hold of the ring, he would have been unstoppable. With humans divided, the elves diminished, and the dwarves unwilling to engage in alliances, all of Middle-earth would have fallen. This isn't to say that the ring makes its owner invulnerable. Sauron lost 3 wars while it was still in his possession, after all. And of course, there are some who are completely unaffected by its power. Tom Bombadil, for example, who put it on, took it off, and made it disappear and reappear without it seeming to affect him in the slightest. But Tom Bombadil is the exception to almost every rule. So that's how the One Ring can be simultaneously the most powerful artifact in Middle-earth, and seem to have relatively few powers in Frodo's hands. It makes the already powerful more so and more hungry for power, but its effect on the least powerful is small. It's why Gandalf was so keen for the humble and not at all powerful hobbits to have the ring. It kept its power, which would always and everywhere turn to evil, dampened down as much as possible for as long as possible. We talked earlier about Sauron's strategic error in leaving to forge the One Ring before the 3 rings for the Elven Lords were forged, but this perhaps was his greatest error. He made the One Ring to make the mighty mightier. He knew the risk that other mighty warriors and sorcerers would wear it and challenge his power,